Hello everyone and welcome to the New Normal Speaker Series. My name is Gjoko and I'm the director of the Ullman School of Design. So far, I had the pleasure of hosting Carol Bilson, Karim Rashid, and Bruce Mann. And my special guest today is Stephen Heller. Steve, welcome on board. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks. It's great to be here. It's great to be in my house talking to you.
Next time we can try to do this in person, hopefully. Steve, I love your books and I have learned so much from you over the years. And by the way, congratulations on your latest book, The Design School Reader, which was published last month. I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Today, I would like for us to reflect on your book, Citizen Designer. I have it right there up on my shelf. Design activism is a very interesting topic for me. More than a decade ago, as a director of the Greenpeace Design Awards, I helped Greenpeace establish the global design competition aimed to attract design activists who could help the organization develop new social and environmental campaigns. This was the poster actually I designed for at a time to promote a call for designers. This was a very successful program that attracted over 1,500 designers from 77 countries. And it was amazing to see how passionate the global design community is when it comes to supporting good causes. So my question to start up this conversation is, how did your book came about? What was your interest in studying this topic?
Well, I've been kind of politicized since I was a kid. I came from a family that were liberal in New York, and I had an uncle who was a Columbia University professor, and he was quite political. And he introduced me to the ideas of liberalism, socialism, and communism. And civil rights was an important issue, as it still is, but the civil rights movement was just beginning to come to the fore when I was 8 or 9 years old. And I got a pretty good education from my uncle. And I wanted to figure out how to translate it. So I translated it through politics. First, when I was 10 years old, I worked for John F. Kennedy. Got to meet him even.
Wow.
When I was older, 15 years old, I started working for underground newspapers, left-wing underground newspapers in New York. I did that for a number of years before moving on to the New York Times. But it put me in the community of activism. And so the book came about because I felt that maybe 20 years ago, designers who were of the previous generation than mine had been very active in what they were doing, not just making design, not just marching in parades, but actually helping people on a macro and micro level. And I felt that designers needed a kick in the butt. And so the first edition of Citizen Designer, which I did with Veronique Vienne, who's a design writer living in Paris, was to kind of gather together people's thoughts on what activism and what politics and what social consciousness was all about. And I think we published the book at a time when more and more people were working with the poor to bring them have a greater educational opportunity, working with the arts as a way of bringing people along into not just the mainstream, but into a counterculture. And so Citizen Designer just became this kind of overall umbrella for anybody who had a tendency or a penchant for social impact.
I love it. So, Veronique Vienen, you coined the term citizen designer. What does it mean to be one?
Well, it basically comes from something Milton Glaser had said. I've known or knew Milton for decades. In fact, in the current edition of Citizen Designer, I think we kind of dedicated it to him by publishing one of his essays on being a good citizen. So he was the one that said to me at lunch one day, years ago, that designers can't just be slaves to their clients. They can't just do what a client wants without introspection or circumspection. They need to be good citizens. That's the most you can ask of anybody. And what does citizenship mean? It means caring for others. It means taking responsibility for your own actions. It means, as he puts it, do no harm. And so I globbed onto that word citizen, and citizen designer seemed like the logical extension for our field. And right now, for example, I'm a partner with people who have bought printmagazine.com or printmag.com, and they're still doing, or they're reviving the print awards. And one of the sections we have in the awards envelope is citizen design. And for that, anybody who works in the public sphere can enter for free. And hopefully we will show some great examples of work that's done for the public good.
That's great. It's interesting how this inspiration comes from Milton Glaser, who sadly passed just recently. It's a great loss to the design community. I think that you and him shared a very similar background growing up as children. He was also, I believe, was quite inspired by similar type of things when he was a child, and he was coming from a family background which activism was normal thing and it was expected of.
Well, he was from a immigrant family. They were from Hungary.
Yeah.
He lived in the Bronx. I was born in Manhattan. He was born at the time of great social flux, the Great Depression. He lived in something called the coops, the co-ops, which was a workers' project, housing project. And he kind of got radicalized as a kid, seeing rent strikes, seeing police on horses breaking up those rent strikes. Even has a photograph of one that he showed when we did a talk together at Cooper Union. But he's always been on the front line of social activism. You know, the term social activism can become a buzzword. It can become, your entry into a particular social group. But Milton always put his money where his mouth was and put his design where his mind was, and always did things that he, right or wrong, thought would be of benefit to the community and the world at large.
Yeah, a lovely book on that topic with Mirko Ilic on dissent, design.
Design of Dissent. Mirko and Milton put together the book. Mirko researched hundreds of posters that were being done for different political reasons, movements, and it was done in 2 editions.
Yeah, it's I actually have the latest edition. It's pretty good collection of different type of campaigns. So you published the first edition of your book in 2003 and the second one in 2018. So what has changed in the 15 years between the two editions on the scene, on the design scene in this area?
Well, on the design scene, there has been more active participation in things like Greenpeace, environmental activism, social guerrilla activism. It's gotten more professional. Whenever there's an issue that needs to be addressed, you'll find 2 or 3 people sending out calls for entry to make posters, which I have mixed feelings about. But I think there is a considerable concern in the world, and not the least of which since the election of 2016, that we're losing our freedoms and we're losing our planet to the greedy upper class caste. I'm reading a book called Caste now, so caste is in my mind. When I say I think it got more professional, I think more designers have become professional since the computer was introduced. More design has taken on both mainstream and experimental veneers. And so there are more designers than ever before. So I think in the time between the first edition and the second edition, people have caught on to the fact that we may be going to hell in a handbasket, and they need to do something. And some people do something by leaving design and becoming therapists or physical trainers. As in the case of one of my close friends who was an art director, she became an occupational therapist. And that may not seem like political action, but it is, because she gave up one profession for another that's intended to help kids, in many cases, autistic kids. So I think there's a lot more activity that has happened kind of naturally coming out of the Bush administration and its unnecessary wars, going through the Obama 8 years, which was very much predicated on changing the world, even though he wasn't allowed to do that, into the Trump administration, which is about destroying the world. And he's had a very good opportunity to do that.
Do you think designers are influential enough to assert a more positive conversation in the current political discourse?
I think designers, we used to think of designers as a segmented group of aesthetes or exceptional people that could work with one foot in the realm of art and aesthetics and the other foot in the world of commerce and pragmatics. And I think that designers have come together, that design is no longer about pure commerce, and it's no longer about pure aestheticism. It's a tool, and it's a profession that requires you have these skills and tools. So yeah, I think there's sophistication enough to have an art director in the White House, which Obama did have with Ashley Axios. I think a lot changed, a lot pivoted when Obama was running for president. And that era that we call the Obama era was a big change for a lot of the ways design was taught, and designers have entered the world.
It's very interesting. I think that probably the biggest achievement of that administration was the establishment of the Presidential Innovations Fellow Program, where lots of designers were brought in, and innovators and entrepreneurs and so on were brought into the federal government to drive innovation. And I was actually also involved at some point with that particular program, and I found it very inspiring that designers were given such a voice to be able to do positive change. But you know, the most the funniest or the most interesting, I don't know how to put it, contribution to design by a president by an American president was, funnily enough, from Nixon.
Richard Nixon, yeah.
Isn't that that will be the person least somebody will expect that has actually contributed so much to the design culture of United States?
I think that's part of it. You know, he started the NEA, he started the Federal Design Program because he didn't know anything about it. And he had an advisor or advisors who said this is a good thing to do. And he didn't have a political agenda related to design.
It was pure design, pure architecture.
It was pure
examples.
Yeah, Milton Glaser and I were on a panel, fortunately during the Clinton administration, to judge the Federal Design Awards. And we were amused because on one hand, there was the ultra professional architects and graphic designers doing things for the Parks Department or Federal Buildings Post Office. And then on the other side were these handmade DIY design events that were being done like for a company of Marines. And all of it was put together under this umbrella of federal design projects. So there wasn't a single person who was in charge of a look. It was very democratic.
Just recently, I uncovered some actual original documents from the federal government from that time, from Nixon. Actually, I have them here in my office, and they were these conferences that they were holding to better understand design and architecture. And it's like reading like who's who at the time in the field. It's absolutely incredible, and just this whole idea, you know. And I think that was probably the greatest time for design in American history, you know, like in terms of how much designers were empowered to just be themselves.
Yeah, it was kind of a crazy anomaly. But, you know, there are all sorts of anomalies that add up to being a movement. And AIGA, for example, when they were asked to do the transportation symbols for the Department of Transportation, and they used Otto Neurath's system of isotypes to create what we now see every day in every airport or bus station, these universal symbols. And that was a design initiative that came from the government and was filtered down to a design organization that gave it to a committee of designers, and it became an important part of the American culture.
Yeah, I mean, clearly design is an exceptionally effective tool for communication, propaganda, and persuasion. And even that brief period of time has left such a strong mark that even today we can see it's still alive in many ways. And this is a very interesting way in terms of when the power of design and architecture has been used for good. We both know many examples in history where that has been done with an opposite intent. When totalitarian regimes, for example, have been using design and architecture for different purposes, which again has been exceptionally powerful from that perspective.
Well, it also goes back to ancient times where, you know, the pharaohs created the pyramids and the Sphinx, and those were ostensibly political acts using design that has been indelible in our minds for ages. I did a book called Iron Fists, Branding the 20th Century Totalitarian State.
Also up there on my shelf, and it has been a massive inspiration for me when I was actually doing my PhD in corporate communication strategies.
Cool.
Thank you for that.
I didn't know I could call you doctor.
Yes.
In fact,
in part, thanks to you, thanks to your work.
I have 2 honorary doctorates, so we could both be doctors together.
You sure can.
Yours is more legitimate.
No, I think you should have had more than 2 honorary doctorates. But no, please tell me more about it. An interesting thing that you pointed actually about the pyramids, and sorry for like just cutting in.
Please.
That was also something that I've studied. I studied all of those things throughout history. The largest pyramids were built by the weakest dynasty.
That's interesting.
And it's a very interesting thing when you see these things, that the grandest kind of monuments of that were done by the weakest, while in fact the most powerful Egyptian dynasty had the smallest pyramids because they were far more focused on trade, on the military, on all these other things. So they were kind of like less feeling the need to show who they are, to demonstrate like that in terms of grandeur. So it's very interesting that sometimes you can kind of see these type of parallels, that the most effective architecture is not always, or symbols of power, they don't always represent the actual power that the ruler commands.
Well, one interesting thing about the design of power and the design of fear are decorations. And I'm talking about decorations that military men wear. And for example, you look at North Korea, and it's amazing that their officers are just covered with emblems, with medals, and each one has some significance, but the larger significance from a design standpoint is to show that they're above eminent, whereas the leader wears nothing but a black Nehru jacket or Mao jacket. When you want to show that you're powerful and want to show that you have control of something, you add to yourself, you add decoration, you add adjectives, you know, your honor, your eminence, your royal highness. That's why America, even though it's a very flawed origin story, is in its pure democratic sense kind of fascinating, because we don't have those over illustrious titles. And I think that was by design.
Yeah, it is. And there is a lot of this type of things. There's a wonderful book actually called Invention of Tradition. I don't know if you come across.
I haven't, but it sounds like a great title.
You will absolutely love it. It's an old book. It's by these British historians, very famous British historians, and they talk about how pretty much everything that we know about the royal family today, that we consider as this very long established traditions, they're actually new, reasonably new, from later part of the 19th century. And that before that, they had none of those type of, you know, pomp or ceremony and all these things. And they go how lots of this type of influences they have been bringing to different colonies in order to instill themselves as rulers, and how they will change the pageantry and all these things to what they felt will better resonate to different cultures. Fascinating things. And it's not, and they're not the only ones who've been doing that. the church has been particularly, the Christian church has been particularly savvy at doing those things in a way that the Christianity was being spread around the
Oh,
world.
sure. And in fact, I was just somebody from Australia wrote me with questions about how I thought about branding, what I thought about branding. And he was, I think, coming from a Marxist perspective, that branding is an evil tool of neoliberal capitalism. And okay, you know, if you want to believe that, that's fine. And I don't disbelieve it, but I think it gets too academic. And what I was saying was branding goes back to Egypt. It goes back to Christianity, because you start with an event. The event was the crucifixion. That event makes a martyr. The martyr has to be represented visually. Martyr on the cross. The cross has to be held up as something sacred. You build churches. Churches look a certain way through architecture. And then everything else falls into place. Then the narrative is the myth of the virgin birth, or the myth of what goes on in much of the Bible. Great stories, but if you take it literally, you can fall into big trouble.
Yeah, branding it's a far older construct that most people understand. You pointed it very well in terms of Christianity and before and so on. And I have been trying to trace down the earliest kind of idea of branding, the earliest concept of branding. And you can trace it down to the very early tribal living. And actually, the very first associations, or where it all derives, the origin, it actually comes from animism and then totemism. And then this type of attributes of these elements, whether it's natural elements, whether it's animals and so on, take on certain symbols that then people started to appropriate and use them as a way to empower themselves symbolically. And you can see that these things exist even today. Like, look at all the sport clubs with the mascots. These are these totems that are kind of like still living today. The emblems of cars. I can go like on and on about these things, but you will see that some of these type of things actually, when it comes to branding, even in a commercial sense, is inherently religious in many, many ways. And it draws on that whole line.
The brand is a religious surrogate. You have to pay homage and fealty to your brand. Brand
Yes.
loyalty is a form of nationalism, a form of colonialism. The brand is a very complex discipline, because it brings in all those things. If you narrow the brand down to modern branding and you come into just the 20th century, it makes perfect sense for corporations to want to have a unified look, a corporate identity. And that corporate identity can be used for good or bad. And what the Nazis obviously did, the Italians did, the Soviets did, is take those symbols and give them a sacred quality, of thus making the brand sacred.
Yeah. One thing, actually, how I started kind of like putting these connections together in the early days when I was doing some research in these areas, I realized that Nazis and Soviets, they didn't have flags like any other country. They had logos, essentially. And for me, that was kind of like, why question, you know, and what made this so powerful? And what is this corporatization of a nation in many ways? how has this come about and what are the connections? And it's been exceptionally well calculated, the element of playing with these symbols in that particular way. And often these symbols have been borrowing from religious elements. And even the church has been doing that. In fact, in the very, very early stages, the original Christian temples were built on the ground of pagan temples. And many Christian holidays have been appropriated from pagan holidays.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Like when the Ottomans, for example, were coming and conquering Europe, they were doing the same. So a church was built on a pagan temple, and then they will come and they will put a minaret on the church and make it a mosque. So it's always about one system of belief replacing the other. But the system of belief is critical. It's ever present.
Well, that's the whole nature of propaganda. It's to propagate a faith. And the faith is that constant system of belief. And designers in the past, and maybe even in the present too, if you're young enough and not as educated as you might be, fall into that trap of enabling business or the state to perpetuate the idea that they want to perpetuate through design. And for me, for example, when Italian fascism arose in 1921 in Italy, Mussolini adopted avant-garde visuals, avant-garde graphics. Who was he appealing to? My supposition is that he appealed to the young, that this was a revolution of the young. And the young wanted a certain conformity in those days. They didn't want to be bourgeois. They wanted to feel like they were being active, if not violently so. And so a whole propaganda plus branding plus identity campaign grew up around that. It kind of organically occurred once it started moving.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And he was doing those things, and with specifically the focus being on youth. That's why he was a big supporter of the futurist movement, where speed and technology, new technology of the time, was being at the forefront, all kind of like pointing, specifically targeting youth people, young people. And funny thing that he was actually hiding the fact that he's a grandfather. He didn't want people to think he's old.
Right.
You know? So that, because that would have, of course, diluted that whole image. But essentially, when we talk about these things, we talk about belief. And design activism is about believing. You believe strongly in a cause, and you try to do something about it. At least that is the case most of the time, but not always.
Not always. Sometimes it allows you entry into a club. Sometimes it's done for social reasons. Sometimes it's done to get credentials. Individual motivations are always going to be different. And I was listening to a Fresh Air episode where the writer Jeannie Guerrero was being interviewed for writing a book called Hate Monger about Stephen Miller, who is Trump's one of his national security advisors, and is responsible for the anti-immigration policies. And she was saying how his mentor was a guy named David Horowitz, who I knew back in the old lefty days as being a left-wing editor for a great left-wing magazine called Ramparts. And something happened where his ideology changed. And he went from one radical pole to the other. I don't understand why exactly, because I've decided not to read any of his books, but I've read articles about him. And, those radical changes happen a lot. Mussolini himself was a socialist, as was his father. And he was named Benito after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary.
Interesting. So I'll share an observation with you also, just in general along some of these lines. Some design activists engage in such activities at a great personal sacrifice. Their personal beliefs and convictions are often greater than the price that sometimes they have to pay for their actions. And making a stand for these designers is often the last resort. Other design activists, however, engage in such activities because they have the social and financial stability that allows them to do that. In other words, they do that because they can afford to.
Mm-hmm.
To what degree do you think that privilege plays a role in activism?
Well, I think it plays a large role. I mean, I was very active during the 60s anti-war movement, working for publications, working for groups and organizations, marching. For other reasons, I was arrested and in jail twice. But I never felt threatened. I wasn't feeling like African Americans today, that if they go out in the street and demonstrate, they could actually have a bullet in them or their neck broken. My parents, as I said, were liberal New Yorkers. They didn't agree with me about the Vietnam War because they were also Depression children who believed that FDR was a saint and therefore, by proxy, the United States was saintly. So we got into, some generational arguments. But I still was able to maintain my position and ability to be active because my parents could afford to allow me that license. And I think many kids of wealthy parents going back decades, maybe even a century, were able to be active because they had the silver spoon in their mouth. So I don't know what percentage, I would not even hazard a guess, but I think that privilege has a lot to do with how you ultimately relate to the world.
It is. And this is something I have come across, often. And even studying design, studying subjects like design, art, architecture, it often is a very privileged thing to do because it comes down not to only whether you can afford to study that or not, but it comes also when you're a child, whether your parents will tolerate you kind of drawing around the house, engaging in these type of creative activities or not. And it's kind of like, I think it sets something in motion that, that your family is probably doing okay enough that they can say, well, okay, maybe you can become an artist, you can become a designer, and so on. And I often find that many designers who actually do this type of work, they do it because they're in a position of privilege to afford to do it, because most of the time this work is pro bono. You don't make money for it. And, so like if you have to choose sometimes between doing a commissioned project versus doing a pro bono, like you really need to be comfortable doing that.
Well, if you have to choose, you choose to pay the rent. But a lot of people don't make the choice. They just do them both. And they can have their cake and eat it, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you can work in a commercial capacity and earn a living and spend your passionate hours doing what you're impassioned by, then good luck. Do it.
Yeah, and this is, I think, that's the kind of the ideal case scenario where you can kind of balance both things. But as you put in your book, Milton Glaser kind of section on good design being good citizenship, and with his, how was it, 10 rules?
10 rules. I think it was called 10 rules to not go to hell or to go to hell.
To not go, well, 10 rules to go, something like along those lines, 10 rules to go to hell as a designer. So where he listed this 10, pretty much very much like a Dante Alighieri type of rundown of things. If you do this and this type of things as a designer, you will go to hell. I actually found it quite interesting, but it does kind of draw this line in terms of like, well, you can be a designer and you can do all these commercial things, but just don't do these particular things. But that was interesting.
But I think that's true in any artistic field. You can go in one direction or another. You can be a progressive and do things that are not necessarily socially significant. I often think of Playboy magazine. It made a huge impact when it first came out. Its art director, Art Paul, was an amazing artist and art director, and he created an innovative magazine that ultimately exploited women. So you look at the exploitation and you balance it with what good it did and how it changed the political way of thinking, the social way of thinking. And you have to figure out on that balance sheet where it stands. I worked, among the underground papers I worked for was Screw. I was the art director, founding art director, and then later came back to it before I went to the New York Times. And, if you're looking at political correctness and you're looking at my complicity in sexism, you could judge me from that perspective. If you look at Screw as a political statement, it was the first magazine to open itself up to a homosexual column, for example. It was the first magazine to address full nudity and censorship. So you can look at it the way I do, as a political act, but you can also look at it as an act of exploitation.
Mm-hmm. Many advertising agencies produce activist campaigns simply because this has often been seen in the industry as an easy way for attracting awards and gaining public attention to their work. Since these campaigns are often done pro bono, the agencies retain usually all creative control over the ads, which in return means that they can push the envelope much further than with paying clients. But there is rarely a real intent in changing anything with these campaigns. So aside of serving as vanity projects, do you find these campaigns are at all effective?
Well, it depends on the campaign, of course. I've seen many birth control, pro-abortion PSAs that are very powerful and very useful. I see Ben and Jerry's as having raised the consciousness of many people through its business leaders against war campaign, its transparency on its packages when it was owned by Ben and Jerry. Kenneth Cole gives a fair amount of his profits to significant charities. Bill Gates and the Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation has really made great strides in the areas that they've supported. So sometimes these things work to the best. I mean, if you look at the turn of the century and the Gilded Age, it was the Carnegie's, J.P. Morgan, Gould's, and other billionaires in America that started the major philanthropies. Rockefellers, none of these people are people I would say stand up to the test of time as righteous people, but they did righteous things.
But they did it mainly as a peer campaign, just simply because they had such a bad, they had such a bad publicity surrounding them, and they had to do these things to create a new image for themselves.
Well,
same as Nobel and the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, I mean, he created TNT, but I think it's more than that. You could create a better image in other ways, and ultimately, their foundations and their charities and philanthropies have done a lot of good for people. So you can hate the messenger, but love the message.
No, I mean, there is certainly something good coming out of it now, but originally the initial intent was for them, it was a peer exercise, no different to how many companies are establishing corporate social responsibility, divisions as a way to.
Well, companies respond to public opinion, just as you and I respond to the opinion of our peers. And so, like every company I can think of now has diversity and equality campaigns. It's better than not having them.
That's right.
And so, since we are in a system that was built on white supremacy, and not in the Ku Klux Klan sense, but in the sense that we are a white country that eliminated or didn't even have the rights for minorities. It's great that these things are happening if they'll serve a positive purpose.
So what do you think it will take for an activist campaign to truly resonate with people?
What it takes is honesty. It takes really a good look, and it has to be promoting a solid message. And all of those things put together will have power. I mean, I've written for the last 6 months about different COVID campaigns. I would say anti-COVID campaigns, but it's not like we're protesting COVID. It's we don't want COVID. And we want people to obey safety protocols, and we want to say thank you to the people who are responding by risking their lives. And so I was involved most recently in a billboard campaign in New York and elsewhere that was sponsored by the Poster House in New York and printmag.com. And we asked a number of designers to come together and create billboards that would hang in Times Square and on telephone kiosks, which either reinforced the idea of safety or celebrated and honored those who were risking their lives. There was nothing political about it. It was all social. And I thought it was a great campaign because it got covered by the media. And it just reminded people that we were all in this terrible mess together. Other than that, it certainly didn't end the disease. And it certainly didn't have, an ultimate effect on the vaccine or on how the president reacts or anything like that. But it had a kind of solidifying effect on those who needed solidifying solace.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think campaigns, you have to decide who your audience is, what your audience wants, and what you want to give the audience to be a successful activist campaign.
That's a good point. It's because as we discussed, designers today are becoming increasingly social, increasingly political, in a sense that they seek to pursue a greater meaning in the work that they do. Young designers today, especially, I believe that they feel more empowered, more responsible, and more accountable for the work that they do. But at the same time, they also like to hold accountable their employers, the government, and the society at large.
As they should.
Yeah, which I think is pretty great. I see this very strong spirit with the young generation of designers coming forward. So what would you recommend to young designers interested in grassroots activism?
I'd recommend that they find groups to work with and learn all they can about what that particular group or individual or organization needs and wants. I mean, the great thing that a designer is able to do now is to help strategize.
Mm.
It's not just about making a logo. It's not just about making a poster. It's what does that logo and poster do as a supplement to the overall message. And I think young designers should find real world ways of doing that. I'm teaching a class in propaganda, the good and the bad of propaganda. And as it's a history class, but at the same time, it's a studio class where these students, I want them to figure out what it is in their own lives, in their own countries, because we have so many foreign students. What is it that they would want to do to change using their talents and skills, and then create a campaign on that, which I hope the outcome would be, I'm going to be educated by what they're doing. Because the bottom line is, I didn't know about the yellow umbrella protests in Hong Kong until one of our Chinese students created that as a campaign, and how to get that campaign known around the world. And her first convert was me.
Interesting. They're very interesting examples of that type of activism and movements. And I think probably the initial catalyst and the way that they started in a more contemporary sense was with the movement that was organized against Slobodan Milosevic, the last president of Yugoslavia, of Serbia, and with this organization called Otpor, which means resistance, and with that fist. And that was it was very interesting because it was the first time that in that part of the world we had branded revolutions. That was, and then it started from there. You had the Arab Spring, you have all the other colorful revolutions happening just before that as well. But that was, I think, that first catalyst. And it was orchestrated from America. It was very funny. They were all trained from America. And they were funded by American organizations how to do these things. Because none of those type of things are typical with the culture that is there. So it was very important form of revolution.
Right.
which again, the Soviet Union was doing the same elsewhere in the world prior to that. And
well, they had been doing that. There was this group that came out of Cuba. There was the Liberation Graphics Organization, which took primarily Cuban graphic propaganda and distributed it throughout the world. And the Cubans were very good at doing what they were doing.
yeah, no, absolutely. There was a very interesting school, I guess, at that time for specifically propaganda communication, and started with. It was very interesting how the overlap actually between socialist realism and capitalist realism, which is the American advertising of the 50s, they were two sides of the same coin in a way that the message was being
They were.
and
They
communicated.
were all about idealization. They were all about heroicization. They were all about making you feel uplifted. So social realism, socialist realism, and capitalist realism all have similar roots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one. Yeah, it's another. That's a different story. I think that's a topic we can talk like for another hour if we start, because I'm also quite fascinated with all those looking historically at all those things. I also wanted to ask you, I see we are coming actually literally to the end of our conversation. I don't know if you have a hard stop or you don't mind if we just wrap
Well,
up.
I can go a little over 1 o'clock.
Okay, well, just because I thought to ask you one more thing that was on my mind. In the new edition of your book, you make an interesting point. You say that the old citizen designer was concerned with the predictable, but the new citizen designer should be concerned with the unpredictable. What do you mean by that?
Well, I was beginning, in doing the first edition, I had a pretty good idea of what was considered design activism or design social impact. In the second edition, I realized there were things going on, say, in the medical field that were not obvious at the time at 2002. There was a woman who was a student of mine who created a medical device for cleaning out the kidneys that you could jerry rig, you could hack, and make it so that it was wearable.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that was an unpredictable social statement. So by unpredictable, I mean going into areas that you wouldn't know you could attack in the positive sense. We've always, during the anti-war movement, there was anti-war, there was rock and roll, there was sex, and there was civil rights and feminism. Those were kind of the 5 pillars of what the youth culture, alternative culture, was fighting for and against in that particular time. Now there are an infinite number of things that we can fight for or against. We could fight for the use or the ability to use native language as opposed to English as a first language. There's the ability to rent strike if you feel that rents are too high and landlords are too catered to. There are all sorts of things that you can throw your attention at issues that you can address that are not predictable and that haven't been predictable for designers to tackle. And I find that with my students when they do their propaganda projects, that there are so many areas of concern that they feel are underspoken for and underrepresented.
Thanks. We have one question from the attendees. How can young designers challenge existing practices, advocate for humanitarian values despite being junior and while keeping fiscal stability?
Well, all of that is a big balancing act. And it's not always, challenge is the right word, because it is a challenge. But I think you just have to devote the time to it and get involved with people, either as a pod or a herd or a crowd or a movement or an organization, and offer your skills and talents. And don't, if you're going to not be able to make a living, you're not going to be able to help other people. So from my point of view, the living comes first, and then you're able to help others.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's as simple a metaphor as you're climbing a mountain and you're losing your support, and so is the person below you. Well, you've got to save yourself first so you can save them.
Thank you, Steve. And I think that's a good way to close the conversation for today.
Well, thank you. You've been a great interviewer.
Thank you so much. I very much enjoy talking with you, and it's really a pleasure. I wish we could do this more often, to be honest.
My pleasure.
Well,
we could do it more often.
We can. We'll be in touch again. So thank you so much for joining me today.